So welcome. Today we are going to discuss CDMRP. I'm going to give an overview of it should take about 8 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A with faculty members who are experienced with this DoD agency. So a little bit about CDMRP. It is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Development Program, also known as CDMRP, which funds basic biomedical research, supporting basic, translational, and clinical research. Each year, Congress appropriates funds for specific program areas. Funds are administered through the U.S. Army Medical Research and Development Command, where CDMRP sits. And CDMRP is just a really great resource for a wide range of biomedical research, from basic science through clinical trials. A little bit about the history and mission of CDMRP. It was created in 1992 by Congress, raising awareness about breast cancer. And then since 1996, Congress has expanded the program to support additional research topics, and it has grown to become the second largest U.S. funder of areas such as breast cancer and prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, and Gulf War illness. I want to touch a little bit about the appropriation process because it does differ from other federal agencies. So the DoD and the CDMRP do not set a programmatic agenda. Rather, Congress appropriates funds each year by request from either advocacy groups or their particular interests. These programs are not guaranteed from year to year, and thus the topics can change. So I pulled this slide directly from a recent CDMRP webinar, which I have a link to in a later slide. And I just wanted to show you here, again, to kind of, first of all, to show the differences between fiscal year 24-25, but just to also show that CDMRP and DoD, they do not pick the program areas. Congress does. So I just wanted to make that very clear. So you can see the comparisons between fiscal year 24 versus 25. And the continuing resolution that was passed in March, there was $650 million allocated to CDMRP for 12 programs. This unfortunately represents a 57% cut from fiscal year 24. However, it is uncertain what fiscal year 26 funding levels will be. And I do know that currently there are advocacy groups trying to get funding restored for various programs in the next fiscal year. So we're just going to have to wait and see what next year looks like. I also want to just take a brief moment and highlight the peer-reviewed cancer and peer-reviewed medical programs, and just point out that many of the topics that aren't funded, that weren't funded in fiscal year 25, that were funded in fiscal year 24, excuse me, are now topics within these peer-reviewed programs. So for instance, I know that multiple sclerosis is something that many faculty here have applied for. And while funding has been cut for fiscal year 24, it is included as one of the topics for peer-reviewed medical, for the peer-reviewed medical program. I just wanted to highlight that because that could be another source of funding for some people. This is just another slide that takes a closer look at the 12 CDMRP programs for fiscal year 25. I've starred the ones where funding opportunities have already come out. Pre-applications are mostly due in mid-June, and the full applications are due anywhere from the end of June to the end of July. So at this time, there are only 3 that have not come out yet. That's the peer-reviewed cancer, prostate cancer, and toxic exposures. Although I just saw that there is going to be another CDMRP webinar focused on those topic areas at the end of the month. I also have a link to that. So I expect that those funding opportunities are going to be out very soon. So I want to switch gears a little bit and just talk really briefly about the application process and the review process for CDMRP. And hopefully we're going to talk a little bit more, we're going to get more in detail on the review process with our faculty panelists. But for the application process, all CDMRP funding opportunities require a pre-application. And each opportunity will specify one of two types, either a letter of intent or a pre-proposal. A letter of intent is not reviewed and it'll only be used for programming purposes, although it is still required. It's not optional. So you won't receive an invitation to apply. On the other hand, a pre-proposal is are reviewed and a formal invitation is necessary in order to submit a full application. So you're really going to need to look at a particular mechanism to see if it's a letter of intent or a pre-proposal that you need to submit. And regardless of the type, each of the PIs need to submit it through the eBRAT system. So it is for the preliminary proposal, the PI does submit it. However, for full applications, PIs must work with their research administrator and SPS staff who submits the application on behalf of the PI through grants.gov, just like a typical NIH proposal. Now I want to talk a little bit, I have 4 points to talk about the review process because it is a little bit different, it is unique. So CDMRP uses a 2-tier review system that incorporates a traditional review with a programmatic review. This 2-tier review process balances funding for projects with the highest scientific merit with those most likely to meet the programmatic goals described in each funding opportunity. Therefore, even a highly rated scientific proposal may not automatically be funded if it doesn't meet the programmatic goals. So that's just really, sorry, that's just really important to point out that just because your proposal may have a high scientific merit, it really does need to meet those programmatic goals. And it's really important to look at each funding opportunity to make sure. Number 2, consumer advocates participate in each review stage. Consumer advocates may include individuals affected by the disease, their caretakers, or advocates for a specific disease or condition. This ensures that research is relevant to service members and their families, veterans, and the broader community. Third, CDMRP does not use a traditional pay line. Instead, applications are individually evaluated for their scientific merit and relevance to programmatic goals. And finally, there is no resubmission process. Each application is considered new. Therefore, it is not necessary or appropriate to discuss how an application addresses critiques from previous applications, as the reviewers will not have seen any of those comments or summary statements. And finally, this is just a slide for some additional information and resources. The one thing I did want to point out is that SUNY RF is hosting their own CDMRP webinar. They're going to have actual program managers attend on Wednesday, June 4th, 2025, from 12 to 1. Many of you may have received an email to register, but I also have a link here to register for that webinar. I've also included the CDMRP webinar held on May 7th and the one that's going to be held on May 28th. No registration is required as it's a live event. It's on Microsoft Teams, so you would just click on that link and you can attend the webinar. And then finally, I included 2 YouTube videos that CDMRP suggests that faculty watch before submitting an application. And so that concludes my presentation. I just wanted to say, if you have any questions about CDMRP, please feel free to reach out. If you're planning on submitting an application to CDMRP, please also reach out to me. I'm happy to help with any proposal assistance. And so I'm here. I'm a resource for DoD and for CDMRP. And so without further ado, I'd like to also now introduce our panelists. And how this is going to work is I'm going to introduce them all, and then it's going to be more of a question and answer. So please feel free to put questions in the chat. But I'll also start us off with some questions to get the conversation going. So first we have Dr. John Letty, who is a clinical professor in the Department of Orthopedics at the Jacobs School. He is the PI on a 4-year, $4.8 million grant to implement the Buffalo concussion protocol in the military environment. The study is run out of Buffalo, but takes place at 2 military bases in North Carolina. He's also the site PI on a CDMRP multi-center lab and field grant led by the University of Rochester to study the effects of repetitive head injury on biomarkers of brain injury. Next, we have Dr. Murali Ramanathan, who is the director of the AI and Clinical Pharmacology Laboratory and a professor in the departments of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Neurology, and the Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Data Science at the University of Buffalo. His clinical research program focuses on the role of metabolism in multiple sclerosis. He has also received funding from the CDMRP multiple sclerosis program on 2 occasions, most recently in 2020. And finally, we have Dr. Fraser Sim, who is a professor and the neuroscience program director in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the Jacobs School. Dr. Sim was a CDMRP multiple sclerosis research program panel member in 2016, 17, and 2023, and the MS research program chair of the Investigator-Initiated Research Awards Study Section in 2018, 19, and 2024. He has also received 3 CDMRP grants in the MS research program, 2 Investigator-Initiated Research Awards, and 1 Exploration Hypothesis Development Award. Welcome, and thank you for agreeing to be a panel member today. I am going to stop sharing my screen here. And I'm going to start with a couple questions. Oh, I think, am I still, okay. So if I can ask the 3 of you, I know I just gave an overview of your experience with CDMRP, but if you can each also provide in your own words what your experience and overview of CDMRP has been. So I don't know who wants to start, but I went in alphabetical order. So if Dr. Letty, if you'd like to start.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I mean, it's pretty much as you laid it out. I guess the experience I had with them was that, and this makes sense for any kind of grant application, is that we applied for a pilot study first through, I believe it was the CDMRP program. You know, they have a smaller grant mechanism there for pilot studies, and we did a pilot study at a military base in North Carolina, and then used the information from that to apply for the bigger grant. So I guess, you know, this is the same thing you do with NIH, right? You do pilot studies and you use that those data for a larger grant application. It helps if you have somebody you can work with in the military already. I'm not, nor have I ever been in the military. So it is a different world than you're accustomed to. So I think it's a real imperative or necessity to have somebody in the military that you can establish a relationship with, maybe do a pilot study with. And then for our large application, we sought support from leaders in military TBI field to provide letters of support, you know, saying that they liked our idea and they were going to help us. Again, it's a different world, and anybody who's going to apply there, encouraged to get contacts within that world because they speak the language and they know the culture. And that helped us. So that's my sort of main takeaway.
Great. Great.
So as Curran mentioned, I've been lucky to get two investigator initiated projects funded through CDMRP. Both of them focused on multiple sclerosis, and I think that the key reason I went in for the CDMRP program was because it was disease centered, and much of my work uh, did not have translational components. It had basic science, basic biomedical research, coupled with very strong clinical collaborative work with the Multiple Sclerosis Center. So that's what attracted me to the MS research program. Unlike Dr. Leddy, I went into both efforts with no military collaborators. So I went in on my own, and since it was an investigator-initiated award, like the NIH, I made sure I had sufficient preliminary data for each of the aims to the extent possible. And I think I think the big advantage, at least from my standpoint, was that many of the reviewers are disease-centered. And so that's probably one of the reasons I got fairly informed reviews.
Dr. Sim?
Yeah, hi. So I guess my experience would have started back when I was a postdoc, and the PI at the time always used to say the DoD is very, very difficult to get money from because it's so small and it's very competitive. So it kind of put me off applying. But then roll around to a few years ago, and I was pushed to apply from the National Multiple Sclerosis Society as an alternate source of funding for MS-based research. And as you know, there are a number of disease-focused panels that are supported by the CDMRP, and I think that's a strong strength of it, is that if you have your research aligned with one of those specific panels, now you're competing in a much smaller pool of investigators for that pot of money. I will say, that then it's been was quite successful with the applications there, and I think, I look at them as a way of increasing the places where you can submit your research, right? Like the investigator-initiated stuff is 3 years, $1 million, couple of $100,000 a year, basically. So it's like an R01 light. So you could take your R01 there and see if you get it funded or get good score. And then they have this exploratory award, which is basically an R21 light. It's a little bit smaller in terms of the budget, but it's basically, I think it's $125 a year, something like that. So they're a great place to get another look at your research. So, if you're preparing a proposal for the NIH, you can absolutely throw it into the DoD and see how it comes out. And I think that's a great way of looking at it. Again, myself, I've had no contact with the military, with the Veterans Association, with any kind of body. It's been basically, they're interested in MS research. They want the best MS research. And yes, if there's relationship with the DoD, that could be helpful, but at least for these disease-centered panels, I don't think it's necessary.
Great. Let's see. So my second question was one that Amanda Klein just asked. So I'll ask that one next, but we will get to the other questions in the chat, I promise. Can you each talk about the differences between CDMRP and NIH in terms of proposal development?
Well, with CDMRP, I have to try to remember this now, but I mean, you have to have your research plan. Those are pretty similar. What the CDMRP wants is military relevance. And that's, again, I don't know about MS, but in the TBI world, you have to show why this is going to be important to them. operationally going forward. And the difference between NIH and the DoD, in my opinion, is that the DoD wants very practical solutions for their service members. I mean, they're interested in science to some degree, but if the science doesn't apply to their service members, at least in my experience, they're not going to fund you. So that's what I meant by getting collaborators in the military, because they can sort of translate that for you. Because as you said, Karen, you can have a great study and they'll say, that's terrific, but how's this going to translate to troops on the field in 2, 3, 4, 5 years or whatever, and they won't fund it. And then in the proposal, you have to prepare a very, very detailed, specific statement of work, they call it, which is basically every step you're going to go through in your study, you know, from applying to IRB to implementing it, to collecting data, to analyzing, to disseminating it, to engaging stakeholders. And that's a very, at least in my case, is a very onerous document to prepare, because it's really detailed, and then they hold you to it. When you get the award, you have to prepare a technical report every 3 months showing which of those steps you've completed. So that's a big difference. This large statement of work, and the military relevance, and then there's also a knowledge translation piece. How are you going to you know, disseminate the results of your research to the military community, to the scientific community? So I haven't applied to NIH in a little while, so I don't know if they have that too, but those are the main differences I saw.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the information I may have on this is from my own experience, and it may be a little dated and potentially wrong, given the fact that the program that I applied to has now merged with a larger program. But in addition to Dr. Letty's comments about the statement of work, which I think is unique to the CDMRP, the MS Investigator Initiative initiated award program had bullet points. And I think in a typical announcement year, they would have 3 or 4 bullet points that change from year to year. And at the pre-proposal stage, it's important, I thought, to pay attention to each of the bullet points and point to a bullet point. I think they called it a focus area in the MS world that needed attention. And they were very, very narrowly crafted in many cases, you know, and in some years they would span. There would be one where you could fit particular aspects of biomedical research, and at the other end of the spectrum, there might be a bullet point where you might be able to fit something like epidemiological or social sciences research in the context of MS. So the bullet points had some range, but they were very carefully crafted every year. That's all I have to add.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities. They might be called slightly different things. Like the technical abstract is basically your specific aims page. The impact statement can be thought of a lot like a significance statement. The SOW is different, but the way I've looked at it and dealt with it, both from a applicant, awardee, and a reviewer, is, you know, you basically just bullet point out your experiments, and you say where you're going to do them, which site it's going to be at, and how long it's roughly going to take. And so, you know, it looks a lot worse than it really is for a typical, you know, basic research grant. You just say experiment 1 is this number of animals on these months, and you know, everyone's right. They do hold you to that post award. They're going to make sure that you do that, but again, you just kind of say, I've done 50% of this experiment, or I've completed this experiment, and then you provide the data that supports that. From this other standpoints of application, you know, budgets similar to a non-modular NIH budget, you have to provide a justification for the spending, but it's just like any other budgeting thing. As long as it's somewhat reasonable, it's never going to get flagged at at study section. I would say that, you know, the focus area that Marley mentioned is really critical. If you're non-responsive, you will not get even remotely good score, or sometimes you can even be pulled. But yeah, that's something to pay attention to, either MS or Gulf War, where I've also applied to. And so I think you just have to be, you know, make that statement very clearly up front why it is responsive to the mechanism. And that's, of course, very different than the open-ended R01 or R21 type mechanisms.
I think the only thing I would add, there are definitely more documents that are required in the CDMRP, just so you're aware. And then they do require a lay abstract. And I just mentioned that because don't sleep on that document, because again, the reviewers are programmatic reviewers, or both reviewers are consumer advocates. I'm sorry, they're not necessarily scientists as part of the panel. So you want to make sure that the non-scientific people can understand what your proposal is trying to accomplish. So I just don't sit on the lay abstract at all as well. I just wanted to point that out. And with the statement of work, that's a very DoD thing. Any DoD proposal, you're going to have to do a statement of work, and it's very, but one good thing is they do have a template for it, and they do have sort of instructions on how to do it. And it's also something that if you were to work with me, I could kind of help guide along too. So I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll take a couple of questions in the chat. And Dr. Sim, I'm going to direct this one to you first. Can you speak about the two-tiered review process a little bit more, since you were on the panel in previous, like how that works in terms of the peer review and then the programmatic review?
Yeah, so I've sat on the equivalent of study section. They contract out their study section with, currently it's a company called GDIT, G-A-D-I-T. And so where I've been primarily involved has been that second stage. The first stage for the MSRP, which is the multiple sclerosis research panel, there is a council, the equivalent of an NIH council, where there are senior scientists involved. These typically people who've either sat on study section or have chaired study session at the NIH, or they're from the MS, in our case, from the National Multiple Sclerosis Society panel. And there are consumer advocates there as well. And they kind of briefly look at the appropriateness of the application to the focus areas. And I would say I've never had an application not go through to the second stage, but I know it can happen. But I think you're mostly, you need to show that you are responsive. And, you know, if it's a investigator initiated, include some preliminary data, or mention that you have preliminary data. If it's a exploratory one, explain why this is innovative and interesting and will have a high impact to the area that you're studying. So in MS, why it will help MS patients. So I think that's the two tier. I wouldn't worry too much about the first tier, but the second tier is the study section. Would you like me to go over some of the details of that, how it differs from NIH? Yeah, so typically study sections at CDMRP are much smaller than a large standing study section at NIH. I think you're talking about 10 scientists, 2 or 3 consumer reviewers, and then members from the CDMRP, as well as the review panel, the review company. Each grant is reviewed by 2 scientific reviewers and 1 consumer reviewer, typically, at least for the investigator-initiated and the exploratory grants that I've been involved with. And so the preliminary scoring is not done in the same way that for NIH. You don't give criterion scores at that stage. You just give this overarching, is it outstanding? Is it excellent? Is it good? Is it fair? I'm not sure, deficient is the one below that. And so those three are then looked at, and typically if there's interest, either consistent interest or even divergent interest, they'll then get discussed at study section. Just like a regular NIH study section, if one person wants to bring up an application that's triaged, they can, and that often happens. and the equivalent of the SRO, I forget if they're called SRO, but they will actually look for divergent ones and bring those up. So you end up discussing a decent number of grants in terms of the total. They do triage at least at MSRP. I'm not sure if that's consistent across all the research panels. And then, the study section is very similar to NIH. The first reviewer presents it, gives a non-evaluative description of the grant, its aims, and then goes through criteria. The main criteria, at least for the ones I've been involved in, has been research strategies, by far the most important, then impact, then personnel. And very much like NIH, you go 1, 2, 3, 2 being the consumer reviewer. The consumer reviewer will typically focus on impact, right? They'll want to see what this is going to affect them from the standpoint of disease relevance. They're not even assigned when they get to do the criterion score. They don't do the criterion for impact and research strategy. They only do impact. They don't do research strategy. And I will say that they have quite a malleable scoring. Like if the 2 scientific reviewers think this is a wonderful application, then they'll go up, and vice versa. If the scientific reviewers pick out some fatal flaw in the science, that will impact their score equivalently. So, while they're very important, you do need that lay abstract. Absolutely. I think that relatively speaking, if you have good science, that's the key thing. And then you go through an open discussion, and then the chair summarizes, then you go back to final scoring, and then the panel scores. So very similar to NIH, but with just a few different wrinkles. Finally, then it goes to council. Council then looks at scores and decides whether or not to fund. And I'm not directly involved in that beyond knowing what my score is and whether or not I've gotten funded. And I would say there is some, based on an N of 4, there is some leeway they have. Like I've had one grant that had a really, really good score, better score than one that got funded, not get funded. And so I think council does have quite an important role there, but that's not something I think we are privy to as applicants typically.
Right. Do either of you have anything else to add, or shall I move on? Let me take a look at a couple of the questions here in the chat. So with the budget having been cut on many programs from fiscal year 24 to 25, will the budget for each program be reduced, or will the number of programs for each release be cut? Will the budget for each program be reduced? I think if you, and I can figure out a way how I can get my slides to everyone, but I think if you look at the slide that has the comparison of fiscal year 24 to fiscal year 25, it shows both which programs were funded versus which ones were not funded for 2025, along with the dollar amounts. So in most cases, if you're one of the 12 programs that was funded for 2025, you were also cut. The dollar amount was cut. I'm not sure if that answers the question. And then some of the program areas are not funded this year. However, I just want to stress, it does not mean they're not going to be funded next year. There are advocacy groups working to get some of those specific program areas reinstated. Who knows, they're in the process of the budget negotiation now. So I don't know if that answers the question. Please let me know. I'm not sure if this one will be for our panelists. Let's see. Does CDMRP support ideas for targeted therapy drug development? The last time we applied, they did not have any negative comments, but suggested we either approach STTR or SBIR for funding, and this was for prostate cancer research. I don't know specifically for the prostate cancer, and I don't know if any of my panelists know an answer to this. What I will say that it depends upon, from my experience, it depends upon the mechanism and the solicitation. Some of them do have drug development and target therapy drug development, and some do not. So it really depends upon the solicitation and the funding and the actual mechanism within that solicitation. Hopefully I answered that question, but I don't know if the panelists have any additional information about that, but
the only thing that I could add to that is that in the MS arena, I think in the last couple of years, they had an element involving clinical trials with a substantial budget component. I can't remember how much it was. And so there was an opportunity to try new agents, but I think there was a requirement that you already have the FDA FDA approval to go forward and try that clinically before you apply.
And let's see, I'm skipping here for a second just because it's similar. So currently the PRMRP, that's a peer-reviewed medical research program, has a technology therapeutic development award. Can anyone speak on this funding mechanism? So none of the panelists are familiar or have participated with that particular mechanism. I don't know if you have any specific questions about it. What I would say is that, again, with that mechanism in particular, there are 55 topic areas within that program. So you'll need to make sure that it focuses on one of those topic areas when you're using that mechanism. But I don't know if there's anything specific. I can also, if you have something specific, specific, you can email me and then I can follow up with you and find the answer to any specific question you have about that particular mechanism. Okay, what do we have here? We mentioned that submitting work that overlaps with NIH proposals. Do they require anything extraordinary for potential overlapping grants?
So I think I mentioned that, so I'll take that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so if the grant is not awarded at the time that we're reviewing it, no one's going to bat an eyelid, right? Like if you have a grant pending for an NIH award and you're applying for something similar, then it's something that sometimes gets brought up at study section and it's immediately just said, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Basically, if you get both grants awarded, then you have a possible conflict. You might have to negotiate with one or other to change the aims or even potentially give one back. But before stuff is actually approved, there's no overlap because they don't exist. So I don't think anyone really, at least at the study section level that I've been involved with, both at NIH and MS Society and at DOD, until the money's actually being given, you don't care. If there is an overlap, like someone's got an award, it's either continuing, then again, it shouldn't affect your scores. It's one of those things that the post-award they will discuss with the investigator to say, you know, where is the overlap and ensure. If it's very, very similar, then yeah, it does get discussed a bit more. But again, you know, I think just being creative and in how you write your grants to avoid the perception of overlap, I think is just part of being successful in that realm.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to turn, I have a question regarding post-award. If you can each give sort of the similarities and differences between NIH during the post-award process, because I know that DoD is a little bit, you know, they do require a lot of reporting and everything. So I was hoping that you can each speak about that.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, there's more reporting. The biggest difference for us was the time it takes. Now, we're not doing basic science studies. We're doing clinical research studies. But it took us 2 years to get through the military, IRB, and bureaucratic approval process for a 4-year award. So the upshot of that is that you're starting behind the 8 ball. I don't know about for basic science MS awards or whatever, but for human research, you have to plan on a very long and involved process to get IRB approval to start your human research, especially if it's taking place on a military base and not a university. So that was our biggest problem. And it wasn't because we were not responsive. We were instantly responsive. It was all on their end. I feel very comfortable saying that. But it was vexing, to say the least. So again, I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists say about this. But from a clinical research standpoint, be prepared for it to take a long time. That's my only advice.
So in terms of the MS research programs, the post-award scenario is not very different from the NIH, at least for the programs I've been involved in. There's an annual progress report that was needed, as well as whatever the financial side of things that gets submitted through sponsored programs. And the only other difference, 2 differences that I think are notable is that you submit the progress report through the eBRAP portal or whatever that's called, and the most annoying thing about that is that it has a password that involves 15 or more characters that changes every 3 months or whatever. So that's I know that's an aside. And of course, when you write up the progress report, you have to link it to the statement of work, which hopefully you prepared along the lines that Fraser recommended. Put your experiments and your sub-aims as items on your statement of work, and then it works out okay most of the time.
Yeah, not much to add. I totally agree with John's comment about IRB and animal approval being huge delays. IRB is called HARPO there. IACUC is called Acuro. Basically, it took us about a year to get IRB approval to work with human cells. And in the future, they just said, when you submit your grants, just say you're going to use cells that are already existing in the lab, and then we don't have to do IRB. And I was like, okay, that's easy. But the IACUC stuff is a pain. Like, so any amendment you make, you have to get approval from Acuro, which is the equivalent of their IACUC, before you can start using DoD money to do those experiments. And I think the key part there is using DoD money to do those experiments. So I've been lucky enough that I don't have to, so I've not worried too much about it. But you know, that's the critical thing there. I will say the reporting is a bit more involved than an RPPBR for NIH. You have to go into a little bit more depth to provide them with what they need. So they've been happy with me. I treat it like MS, where you actually give them data. But otherwise, it's not that much will work. On the nice side is that they can't cut your funding after they've given it to you, or at least that's what they've told me. So they give the check to UB up front, as opposed to NIH, where they're giving it each year. So in the current environment, that was a relief.
Yes, yes. And again, that goes back to the differences in terms of how money is appropriated to CDMRP. So the plus and minus of that. Okay. So I've got a couple of questions here in the chat. Does anyone know how much the scoring and criteria differs by the program? I've served as an ad hoc reviewer for 2 different CDMRP programs, and it was somewhat different across the 2. I will say, based on those experiences, also that the consumer input was very important. And even if your application is scientifically sound, if the consumer doesn't think it's a good idea or will help military members, veterans, that was seriously considered. I don't know if anyone, if Fraser, if you want to add, since you've been.
I mean, I think it's. I want to say this one thing. I know MS patients, and these are all the people on the consumer review are MS patients who've served or are involved in the VA. MS patients are incredibly well versed in their disease and the disease and the science around the disease very well. They actually understand a lot of it. And so the folks we've been involved with have luckily enough, they've really grasped the science. And unlike, I would say, what Dr. Leddy's involved in, you know, MS is not a battlefront concern necessarily, right? This is a disease that affects soldiers, it affects veterans, but it's not, you know, the relevance is the fact that the general populace gets MS, so do service members. And so it's a little different, I would say, than the type of work that's very much focused on battlefield injury, battlefield related trauma. And so I think, obviously, for Dr. Leddy, it's critical, and I think less so for the MS and maybe prostate research, other cancer research, where these are more attendant diseases than caused necessarily by serving. I think Gulf War illness, which was a mechanism I applied for, yeah, you had to really show that it was relevant. And maybe that's what did my grant in, was that we were just mostly doing work on mechanistic insight in small animals, and they might have wanted something more applicable to a translatable intervention in soldiers suffering from GWI. So I think it varies.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. I would think that each program area would have its own personality. I mean, the process is overarchingly the same, but it would probably depend upon each personality of how the process would be and the importance of military readiness. They always stress that you should be able to, you know, express that in your proposal. So I would suggest putting it in there. But yeah, I would say it definitely would vary. I think I can answer this next question, which is sponsored programs familiar with the grant submission process, and are they responsible for the actual submission? Yes and yes. So as I mentioned, for the pre-application, PIs do submit that on their own through the eBrep system. So whether it's a letter of intent or a pre-proposal, that is submitted by the PI. However, if you do submit a full application, then you would do it like a traditional NIH. It would be through grants.gov, and SPS needs to be the submitter on those applications. And then I will also add again, I'm here as a resource, working with your research administrators. I can help with the proposal submission process as well. So I just wanted to, you know, give a plug out again about that. Okay, so I have one more question here. This one, you know, I'm guessing again, the experience would be varied, but do you have any suggestions, or have you had any opportunity to deal with to work with the program managers at CDMRP? They're a little more elusive than an NSF and NIH, so I was just wondering what your experiences have been with the program managers.
I think I'd agree with that, but at least ours is very good.
Good.
You know, she's very helpful. She understands, you know, the frustrations that the investigators have with the snails-like pace of approvals for IRB and things like that. So I found her to be generally responsive and helpful, and you know, when you submit technical reports, you can submit it to them beforehand. They'll review it and say you need this, this, and that on your, you know, your every 3-month report. So they help you make it better, and that way it doesn't get rejected. So I think my experience has been good with them in that from that standpoint.
Great.
My experience working with them has been very good. In my case, they've been mostly hands-off. And the only other comment that I will make, at least regarding the MS program, is that the program offices have turned around. There's been a lot of turnover on the personnel side. So, you know, on my last MSRP grant, I had 3 or 4 program managers come in, and they signed you a nice introductory letter. And that's the only observation I have regarding program offices.
Nothing to add. I think my experience is identical to Morale and John. I mean, I think when I've needed something, they've been very responsive, very professional. You know, no concerns.
Okay. We actually have another question in the chat. Is the extra level of IRB approval required for all studies, even if the clinical studies are only being conducted on UB's campus? Who wants to take that one?
Sorry, it's about clinical studies.
Yeah. So is there an extra level required for all studies, even if the clinical studies are only being conducted on UB's campus?
So the answer to that, I believe, is yes. You do require this extra level. What I'm not sure about, and I will find out since we're the site PI for the Rochester multi-center trial, which is all being run on US college campuses, not on a military base. I'm interested to see if that approval process is faster than the one we've had to go through when we're doing the actual intervention on military bases. It seems like it's going smoothly so far, but I don't know the answer yet. You know, I'm going to hazard a guess that it is going to be faster if you're doing a study, you know, on UB's campus as opposed to in another state on a military site. So I expect it will be, but I can't say it for sure because we haven't done that yet, and the Rochester process is still going on, and that hasn't been a year yet. So maybe someone else has an answer to that, but I don't really know.
So in my case, I was not involved in a clinical trial. I was using pre-existing data and samples from human subjects, and it was all UB. I had everything at my disposal. I had an IRB approval for the study itself. But I think that the process was instituted, I would say about 5 years or 10 years ago. And it happens almost before you can even start spending on the grant in my case. And you have to sort of fill out their forms. And I can't remember what the form is called. I think it's a HSRPP or something like that. And they have to review it, and you submit it, it goes quiet, suddenly you hear back, and it can be iterative. They'll come back with comments that you have to address and go back into the system before you can start your work. And in my case, I think it took 3 or 4 months, even though I had no particular interventions planned as part of my research.
Right.
Yeah, my understanding is, yeah, if you do any IRB or IACUC related work, you need to go through them first. Before you can spend money on that. You know, you can do that work if you're not using DoD money, right? But if as soon as you use DoD money to support that work, you need to have the prior approval before you do any of those steps. And yeah, 3 or 4 months sounds about right. For the IRB, yes, it took us a year, but that might be because of use of human tissue samples that were flagged and needed the, I don't know, the directed, I forget what the correct term, but it was like the chief lawyer of the whole army had to look at it before they said yes, so it took forever.
Right. Okay, does anyone, we have 5 minutes left, but I'm happy to end now unless anybody has any other questions, or feel free to shout them out or type them in the chat. Otherwise,
I will say this, if anyone wants copies of grants or forms or whatnot, I'm happy to share. So just reach out individually, and also studies, summary statements if you want to see what they look like. So anything.
appreciate that.
Same
Really
here.
appreciate
Very
that.
generous. Very generous. Thank you.
Same here for clinical.
Thank you.
And
I
same
have,
here.
I have one more quick question.
Sure.
We had submitted the CDMRP grants several years ago. We actually got pretty close to being funded, but then we did not resubmit it at the time. So that was back in 2022. If we submit something similar now, will they look at the previous reviews? No.
No, they don't.
Okay.
But there is like I'm lucky enough to serve on a run of years before I applied for DoD, and then because when you apply for a grant, you can't serve in the state section. So the 3 years I didn't serve, I was submitting grants. You do see the same grant come back year after year. So there is that kind of institutional memory, but it's not formalized, right? Like you're not looking at this as a resubmission. There's no introduction. But you might be familiar with the work as a reviewer. I don't think they take it into account when assigning the grant to the reviewers. But if you're sitting on the panel and you see that grant come up, you're like, oh, okay, I've probably seen that before. So yeah, I think it's good and bad, right? It's a fresh institutional memory because there's often turnover of panel members, but then it's bad because you don't get that kind of, I've dealt with all your concerns. You've got to give me a better score kind of position that you have in NIH.
Right, right. And in fact, you would not want to address previous critiques.
No, you
in
shouldn't
your
mention.
application. Yeah. Any other questions? Going once? Well, thank you to the three of you for serving as panelists today. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get a lot more submissions to CDMRP.